Welcome to TriloTalk. This is a podcast dedicated to topics that we think are important to the profession of medical writing. And our goal is to bring topical issues to the forefront and hopefully spark conversations in the wider domain about these issues.
Welcome to our podcast. Today we're going to talk about the EU-CTR and its impact on medical writers. I am Nidhi Johal. I'm Director of Medical Writing for Trilogy. And I have here with me Douglas. And I will pass it over to Douglas to introduce himself and then talk to us and tell us more about the EU-CTR.
Hi, Nidhi. And I am Douglas Fiebig, one of the senior partners here at Trilogy. We are heavily involved in the writing of regulatory documents relevant to the running of clinical trials. And so something which is very important to us is understanding as medical writers what the clinical trial regulation here in the EU means.
All right, great. So Douglas, can you tell us a little bit more about what is the EU-CTR?
Okay, well, the regulation, it replaces the original clinical trial directive that was operational in Europe for many years, which was basically the guideline on how all the different components you need to establish and run a clinical trial within the EU or the European Economic Area, actually, so the EEA. And one of the downsides of that process was that you had to do an application in every single European country where you were going to conduct the study, which is obviously a lot of work, particularly when different countries have different regulations and requirements. So what has now happened is to come up with the regulation comes up with a centralized process. So rather a little bit like the centralized process here in Europe for a CTD submission for applying for regulatory approval. It's the same basic principle, obviously many different nuances are different, but the basic principle of having one member state of the European Union, which is your champion and the one where you make your application, and they basically take care of all the interactions with the other countries involved where the clinical trial is going to be run. So so it makes one structure applicable to all the member states, and that's kind of one word which you'll hear quite often during this podcast is member state means nothing other than a European country, either within the EU or the EEA. And the other thing is that it is, of course, quite a monster. It's 80 pages and not such easy reading. So what we'd like to do here is to try and provide a little bit of an overview of what we're dealing with here and what we as medical writers believe is of interest and relevance.
Okay, great. I think one thing to note here before we move on to that segment is that the EU-CTR, it is binding all EU member states, right? And there is a 3-year transition period. And I think what I found really interesting was at least until 31st of January 2023, sponsors can choose to submit the clinical trial applications under EU-CTD or EU-CTR. But after 31st January 2025 onwards, all clinical trials will be regulated under the EU-CTR. So I think that's a really important point to note for our medical writers out there. So
and that's what our clients are very interested in now, because they're finding that they absolutely have to do it now. Beforehand, it was not binding for all trials.
Exactly. All right, so then let's talk a little bit about what the CTR text covers, this 80-page monster document. What's in it?
Well, it's basically got something for everybody in it. If we just run down very broad categories, it obviously defines the scope of what the CTR covers, which in principle is all clinical trials conducted in the EU, apart from non-interventional studies. It has a whole slew of definitions, which are interesting, not really a topic for here, but they make this distinction between studies and trials, which is something which is also made in other places. And of course, that leaves us as medical writers in the position of what is actually the definition to be used. There is no one definition across the whole industry. It covers ethical aspects, including ICH GCP and GMP, which is much more prominent in this, so good manufacturing practice. Here, it draws on a lot of existing guidance, but puts it together in a framework for conducting clinical trials in the EEA. There are other components, safety reporting during the trial. Again, many of these are already in existence, so it's nothing new. We'll come to timelines later on, which are defined. That is something a little bit different. Compliance and accountability, the oversight by the member states, their responsibilities, how study findings are to be reported. So, in short, the CTR addresses all the obligations for running a clinical trial from its inception within the CTA process, so the clinical trial application process, right through to reporting the results in the clinical study report and the lay summary at the very end of the process.
Right. So obviously by doing this, there's meant to be a lot of benefits, right? Pros. So let's talk about that for a second here. I think one of the things that's worth mentioning is the CTIS, right? The CTIS is a portal for uploading submission documents. And I think it allows for centralized single electronic submission instead of multiple submissions with different dossiers. And so what this means for sponsors is that they need to upload and submit all data, including initial clinical trial application data and documentation through the CTIS. Aside from that, there's a few other things that I think that's really interesting. For example, instead of needing both the NCA, which is a National Competent Authority, and the Ethics Committee, the EC approvals, EU-CTR also allows a single NCA and EC decision per member state. What other benefits, Douglas? What other pros can you think of?
Well, I think the overall having a single process applicable across the whole clinical trial application procedure does reduce delays in clinical trial initiation. It makes the whole process much more efficient. And obviously that is one of the main objectives, is to enable clinical studies to be conducted more efficiently, which then translates into bringing medicines to patients more quickly. It clarifies in many different places the application of good manufacturing practice, which is not something we as medical writers in the clinical world would be necessarily involved in, but it is something to be aware of. And it also defines requirements for ethics committees. It streamlines the safety reporting components. The one which is perhaps much more relevant for medical writers is that it defines transparency and disclosure obligations. And that is something which has kind of been simmering for a while here in Europe. And the infamous Policy 70, for example, which lays out a number of requirements and then was kind of like put on ice a little bit. And now with this clinical trial regulation coming into force, there is this obligation for public disclosure of a lot of information coming from a lot of the documents that we write as medical writers. So that is something which has implications not only in needing to be done, but also within the framework of when it needs to be done.
Right. I mean, I think until now, transparency generally had not been necessary until the product approval stage. But now with EU-CTR, transparency is required throughout the development process. And I think the aim is, to increase information sharing among studies, promote more public awareness, understanding of clinical trials. I think that's also another reason why summaries of trial results, including layperson summaries, must now also be submitted via the CTIS. So we've spoken a little bit about the pros. What about the cons? What are some of the challenges or downsides?
Yeah, I mean, I must say, speaking as a medical writer, I don't see many downsides. We will look in a minute at the different documents which need to be prepared. And I think for everyone who's been experienced in preparing clinical trial applications, there'll be a lot of familiar components in there. I have read that for smaller companies, it's become a little more bureaucratic with the whole structure there, with the amount of effort that they need to put in, the amount of documentation. It's more process for them than they may be used to. I don't know if that's only sort of like a beginning, an issue at the beginning, and then they get used to it, or whether it really is something which is slightly disadvantageous. for us as medical writers and also for regulatory people at sponsor companies, the tight and rigid turnaround times that are defined in the process can be quite a challenge. And we're talking about timelines once the CTA has been submitted and has started to be assessed. And so we'll look at a little bit at timelines in just a minute.
Yeah, timelines, something that medical writers just can't get away from, is it?
We love timelines. Yeah.
All right, so then let's talk a little bit about the CTA and how it's structured. So there's two parts, right? There's a part one and this part two. And I think this is the part that's going to make it really interesting for our medical writers who are listening to the podcast. What is it about part one, Douglas, then that's worth mentioning to our listeners?
Yes, so I think part one is that part which is of most interest to us as medical writers. It's where the documents we know and are familiar with are positioned. So part one is rather loosely called the scientific part. It's not only the scientific part, it also has administrative aspects to it. For example, a cover letter, an application form. Those are things which we as medical writers are really not likely to be involved in. But then the other documents required are the ones which are required in any case, and pretty much not only in Europe, but anywhere. So let's just start the clinical study protocol. So that is an important component of the trial application. It always has been, and it always is, no matter where you're running a clinical trial. And that, of course, is defined by good clinical practice, and nothing changes in that respect. So what the CTR does is just it draws on GCP to say, okay, within our framework of running a clinical trial in Europe, a protocol according to the requirements of GCP and other national and international requirements needs to be written. So nothing really changes. Let's just take a look at the other documents there. So the investigator's brochure. Well, the investigator's brochure is also something we've always required running clinical studies, and nothing changes from that. Also, not even the requirement that if you have a product which is already on the market and you're maybe doing a study in a different indication, that you can use a simplified SMPC, so the summary of product characteristics, in place of an investigator brochure. That provision was already there before. So the trial regulation just draws on that and defines it within the new framework. The investigational medicinal product dossier, which is a horrible mouthful, but otherwise called the IMPD, is in many respects overlaps with components of the investigator brochure, but the IMPD was also always a component of a clinical trial application here in Europe. It's very comparable to the IND that you see in the FDA requirement, and the content of that is not redefined in the CTR, so it really stays as is. There is a new component, the so-called auxiliary medicinal product dossier. Now that I think we don't have the time here to drill down into that, but an auxiliary medicinal product is one that is it's defined and used within the context of the trial, but it isn't actually itself being investigated. So take, for example, rescue medication in an asthma study. You're investigating an asthma product, maybe with an active or a placebo control, but you also have the provision for a rescue medication, and that would be an auxiliary medicinal product. So there are requirements now to include information on that as well. Then, if applicable, information would be included in part one on scientific advice, and a pediatric investigational plan would be included if that's applicable. Depends what the constellation is of the study being involved in the product, and the content of the labeling, or the proposed content of the labeling of the investigational medicinal products. And then finally, there is a requirement in part one to have proof of payment of the fee. That's obviously not something for medical writers, that's more for the finance department, but it just comes under that. So most of the content is written by a medical writer, apart from those administrative parts.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those other parts would be typically covered by regulatory, wouldn't they?
Yes, hopefully, because I wouldn't like to have proof of payment.
or CMC actually.
Exactly. I mean, I think in that respect, that's an important point you bring up, Nidhi, because the IMPD, if you're dealing with something like a new chemical entity, then most of the IMPD is going to be more the CMC involvement, dealing with section module 3 there. But the or the module 3 equivalents that you have in the IMPD structure for Europe, but nothing has changed there. So that was a requirement already beforehand.
Okay, and I think what I wanted to add to that was that irrespective of the number of states involved, Part 1 is assessed by a single member state, and that they will generate a single Part 1 assessment and a single Part 1 conclusion that will cover all member states. Now,
Correct.
Part 2.
They will interact with the other member states as required.
Yes.
So the other, but you're right. It's all funneled through the one authority.
Yeah, and that's where maybe Part 2 is a little different, right? Part 2 is, each member state assesses Part 2 separately, especially because of all the other components that goes in there, like the financial arrangements, the proof of insurance, etc. But let's talk a little bit more about the Part 2 then. Part 2 is really mostly stuff that we medical writers would not get involved in, right? Aside from ICF, I believe it is, right, Douglas?
Yes, that's right. So I would say that's probably the only part that we as medical writers would be involved in. And typically that is actually dealt with when you're developing protocol. Yeah, so they're very much related with each other. But of course, you have for the informed consent requirements to have it in the local language. So European countries with different languages, you will have
translation.
You'll need the translations of those there. So that is the main part that the medical writer will be involved in. Just to run down so that people know what else is in Part 2, which is in Part 1 is called the scientific review, Part 2 the ethical review components, and that is by each member state. So each member state will assess these, but being coordinated by the reporting member state, which is the one coordinating the whole process there. So the other components of Part 2 include things like recruitment arrangements, suitability of the investigator, suitability of the facilities for conducting the study, proof of insurance cover or indemnification. Now that's of course something which is going to vary hugely across different countries. So you can see why they've done this division between Part 1 and Part 2. Financial and other arrangements, they're also going to vary hugely across the different member states. And then finally, something which is more prominent here, but is also nothing new as such, is proof that the data are processed in compliance with data protection law here in Europe, which is now very stringent and certainly very broad-ranging.
Sure. GDPR.
GDPR, that's right, the General Data Protection Regulation.
Yeah. All right, so then let's drill a little bit into what this means for our medical writers then. Does anything change for medical writers regarding documents that they would typically prepare for clinical studies?
So, yeah, the answers are really yes and no here. So
let's start with no.
Let's start with no, because that we kind of already touched on already. So the main documents we write, the protocol, the IMPD, the ICF, none of these per se really change. Yeah, what changes is just the framework within which they're written and how they're submitted then afterwards. So the protocol, the IB, the IMPD, the PIP, the pediatric investigation plan, and Part 2 would be in the informed consent form. They're all written according to existing guidelines. And then also the CTR defines safety reporting and the fact that the study results need to be written up in a CSR. Again, the modality of safety reporting and what you report, expedited reporting, etc. None of that changes. And the clinical study report is also a requirement that has been a requirement for many, many years, that as such, covered by ICHE 3, the structure of the content is not changing at all with this. But what does change as I've touched upon, public disclosure, which we'll take a little look at now, and then also the timelines. Yeah, so
Dreaded
that is,
timelines.
yeah. So yeah, I think basically let's start with the transparency and disclosure.
All right. So the CTR basically says that almost all documentation will be made publicly available, right? So most of the documents that medical writers are working on, they will need to factor in the redaction step. So what more can we share then regarding this whole aspect?
Well, redaction is very interesting because there are two main components, and one is personal information, so about individuals, personally identifiable information, and the other one is commercially confidential information.
The CCI.
So CCI, and in the context of a running a clinical trial, certainly when you're setting it up, when you're applying to run it with the clinical trial application, you're not going to have much in the way of personal information. What you do have is commercially confidential information. You remember we said that the IMPD contains a large component of CMC information, so information on the drug substance, on the drug product. This does not need to be disclosed publicly, and the clinical trial regulation specifically says just that. But nevertheless, we need to take a look and see what may need to be redacted in other parts. Let's just start off with the clinical trial application here. So personal information, you'd need to look through and see if there is anything. Potentially there could be something in background information involved somewhere. It's not something you could ignore, but just to say it's something you're unlikely to come across. The CMC component of the IMPD does not need to be disclosed, so that doesn't need to be redacted. But you would, for example, in the protocol, in the investigator brochure, have some information on the drug product, perhaps the drug substance as well, and then that would need to be redacted. And I think redaction is obviously another whole podcast that we don't have time for here, but to say,
Yes.
in a nutshell, you cannot just determine yourself what is CCI and say we're going to redact that. You have to justify it. So you have to identify it, you have to document what you want to redact in that, and then you in the so-called justification table, and then that is reviewed by the EMA, and they will get back to you. So it's really the so-called Google test. You as a company may believe something's confidential, but if they say, well, we can see that in the public domain, then it isn't, and then you wouldn't be allowed to redact that. So that's the CTA, the start of the study. The redaction obligation, or the obligation for public disclosure, continues throughout the process. So there's various provisions which we'll come to in the context of timelines about when requests for information are raised and responses are required by the sponsor. But if we come to the end of the process, the clinical study report, that is obviously somewhere where you are going to need to take a look for potential personal information, as well as CTI that needs to be redacted.
All right. So basically, in a nutshell, what we're saying is that the documents that will be subject to public disclosure include, for medical writers again, the protocol, the IB, the IMPD, and ultimately the CSR and lay summary.
Exactly. Yes.
All right. Well, then I think we should talk about the dreaded timelines that us medical writers love. So what does that mean then? I mean, what we're saying is that nothing changes in the timeline, right, for the protocol and the IB. These are driven by the programs itself. But just like an ECTD submission in Europe, the clock starts ticking on day one, doesn't it, Douglas?
That's exactly the point. So, so whether a protocol is written under strict timelines or not has nothing to do with the CTR. As soon as you submit and press the button in the for the submission, then the clock starts ticking, and then there is quite a rigid time frame during which the application is assessed, and so there's initial validation period, and then there's which happens by day 10. So the timelines are very rigid, both for the member state assessors and for the sponsor there. So it's not just the sponsor being held to this. Typically, what we're talking about is an assessment period of about 45 to 76 days.
Calendar days, right? That's what we're talking
Calendar
about.
days, not business
Yeah.
days, so calendar days. And why that varies is because it depends really a little bit on how often the reporting member state issues a request for information to the sponsor. So if you make your application and they have no request for information, then everything's going to go really smoothly and you're going to have a very quick assessment period. Whereas if there are various different essentially questions that they have or requirements for further information, then they're going to reach out to the sponsor, and the sponsor then has, by and large, 10 days to respond. So
Right.
10 calendar days to respond to those RFIs for that.
Yeah.
And that is quite a challenge, I would
That
say.
is, yeah. That's not a lot of time at all, is it?
So, and there are, I mean, we don't want to go into all the different timelines here, but essentially those timelines, the sponsor has 10 days, then there's a turnaround time by the reporting member state as well. And there are different points where you may get further requests for information. So, and there may be times when if you get no request for information, you can just assume then, if you haven't heard within a particular time frame, then that the process moves on to the next stage through to what you're looking for is acceptance. Yeah. And just to perhaps bring in here together that there is the provision for part one, the scientific part, to be submitted without part two, which is the ethical part for the individual country, so that you can have that assessment done and you can submit part two later on. And of course, there's also a timeline. You can do that within 2-year period. So if you don't submit part two within 2 years of having submitted part one, then essentially you've stopped the process.
Right. Very interesting, for sure. So I guess then we should move on and see what else is there, that we should probably share. I mean, we said that there was this 80-page monster document, but how about this Q&A document? I suspect that's also very long.
Oh yeah, so that's approximately twice the length. So it's 159 pages.
Wonderful.
But it is actually a very helpful document, and it's something which often in the guidelines or in the regulation, it's not awfully clear what is meant. And what they've done is they've gathered questions. They put out a request for questions, and have responded to those in there. So it's well worth taking a look in the CTR Q&A document. They're leafing through it. For us as medical writers, some things are not particularly relevant. You can just move on. I think there's procedure and terminology clarifications there, which for me anyway, I find a great resource just so that I become much more familiar with the overall process, the overall expectation. It is extremely detailed, but like I said, could be helpful. And I think on a practical note, there's not that much which we as medical writers, when we're writing a document, is going to change dramatically. There was one interesting thing. I worked on a CTR process with one of our clients, and we were actually at the fairly late stages when somebody said, well, they'd really read this Q&A document in detail, and there was something new in the protocol synopsis which was expected. And there's a lot of discussion around this, because obviously when we're writing protocols, we're thinking more about GCP, where that's initially defined, and now we have ICHM 11, which defines in a more structured fashion, a more standardized fashion, how a protocol is expected to be written. And in the CTR, there is this provision in the protocol synopsis to include a benefit risk analysis. And that is something which is in neither of the other documents. So it's always worthwhile as a medical writer having a broad overview of a lot of these different regulations so that you can synthesize out something that is going to be fit for purpose. Coming from that, just something else, the question and answer document does emphasize that the synopsis should be 2 pages.
I love that. I think that's my favorite part.
I think that's something I've yet to experience, it being 2 pages, but I would love to, because I think many of our clients just wouldn't accept us reducing down protocol synopsis to 2 pages, but it is there in the guidance.
Yeah, and that's great. And I guess that is helpful if you're isn't it? Which we really do advocate for here at Trilogy.
Absolutely.
All right, so it looks like we've covered a lot, right? I feel like there's so much that we can talk through this topic and probably have multiple podcast sessions about it. But hopefully, we've provided some useful insights into what the CTR means for medical writers. And it sounds like we're really just scratching the surface here.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think every medical writer in the regulatory field really has to have some understanding of the CTR, certainly if you're working here in Europe. And I think it also helps you not only in terms of writing the documents, but interacting as we do in our organization, Nidhi, where we're often asked by our clients, so what do we need to do to make our documents CTR compliant? And so that's useful, having that sort of body of information as a background to be able to draw on and reassure our clients and say, okay, this is what you need to do, but a lot of things you don't need to change.
Absolutely. And I think what's really important as well to remember is that the whole point of this, right? The why are we looking at the EU-CTR? It's really because this EU-CTD had its limitations, right? And really the point here is to increase EU's competitiveness in the drug development market. And so hopefully with this now in place, it's going to be more efficient clinical trial submission and assessment process. So I think there's a lot of benefits to it. It's definitely more that we're going to keep seeing in the industry, and especially as medical writers, like you just said. So yeah, I think
I think absolutely, and I think the efficiency is obviously always important. Mm-hmm. There's always the pressure to do these activities in less time. I think the other interesting thing is just the prominence of public disclosure in there, and so it's bringing the whole regulatory documentation field out into the public domain, where people can really see and understand what it takes to develop medicines.
Exactly, absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap. Then we can end here. Hopefully, this was useful to our listeners. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you learned something new about EU-CTR and its impact on medical writers. Until next time.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye then.
So thank you for listening to TriloTalk today. If you enjoyed it, please come back and listen to us again. If you have feedback on this or any of our sessions, we would love to hear it. In addition, if you have ideas for future topics that you'd like us to cover, particularly something you think the community should be talking about, let us know. We would like this to be an ongoing conversation with medical writers at large, and you can send us comments on our Twitter feed or on our LinkedIn page. Just a reminder, you can find all our episodes of the TriloTalk podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and trilogywriting.com/TriloTalk. Have a good rest of your day.